What's up, guys? Here's a new episode of Bullet Points, which is how I call my mini series, where I go over content that I either read, researched, learned, courses, articles, whatever I come through during the week, where I try to take some times to continue my education or my knowledge or explore concepts that I'm working with on the field with clients. And I like to kind of summarize it. It's great for me. It's great for you. I do quick breakdown of research reviews, which you might not have interest into, but you still want the information. So I put it out there for you guys. We all know in Montreal here, we're in a, I don't even know which lockdown is, the fourth or the fifth or whatever. But these lockdowns are usually very bad for business, obviously. Although they're great for content creation. So if I cannot be making money, I'm going to be making content, and that's where I'm going to invest all my effort now, and I'm going to try to keep that going even when gyms reopen and try to get a nice flow. I think it's good to put things out there, even though it doesn't necessarily convert into growing the business, but just growing the brand, growing what we are about at TSTF and Team Solomon, and how we go about diving deeper into understanding exercise science, physiology, and nutrition as well. So I speak about nutrition because a lot of the points I'm going to be bringing up today, as a matter of fact, all of them are mostly related to nutrition. And if you guys are following me up close, you know I'm a big fan of like the biomechanics and the physics of training. And sometimes I feel like, man, I'm putting so much content out there about how training can impact hypertrophy or strength, how your different approach in training can have huge physiological impact as well. And I don't always talk about nutrition. Some of it is because I find nutrition to begin with, if you're fueling your body enough to perform um, with basic foods, there's not that many things that you're going to be manipulating in order to have like drastic change, right? Obviously, we all know fruits and veggies are great for you, and you need to eat a certain amount of protein. I just feel like sometimes it might be redundant, even though a lot of people are still not aware. To me, personally, it's been a decade that I understand how macro impact training and body composition, and it's hard sometimes to like bring that down to things that some people just have never heard about. But regardless, I will try to put more nutrition content out there. So I'll start right away with first study review. The title of the research was Energy Deficiency Impairs Resistant Training Gains in Lean Mass but Not Strength, a meta-analysis and meta-regression by Murphy and al. 2021. So this is basically a meta-analysis, and I will break down shortly what a meta-analysis is, which is a statistical procedure combining data from multiple studies in order to increase the power of the predicted outcome. It's kind of a half researched definition, half like kind of I rephrase it in a way that, like, the way I see a meta-analysis is basically a bunch of research that fit certain criteria, and then you combine them all together. You analyze the statistical power of the outcome of all this research, and then you kind of make a conclusion. It's either more on one way or more on the other, or directly in the middle. Regardless, this research was a meta-analysis of a total of 52 studies. And the main findings were that a caloric deficit interferes with hypertrophy significantly more than it did with strength gains. Okay, so overall, people who were in a caloric deficit, and I will dive in deeper into like how much of a deficit they were and everything, but basically people who were in a caloric deficit had a harder time putting on muscle than gaining strength. Okay, might have noticed this by experience, right? It's not really rocket science. When you're not eating enough to be at maintenance and you're losing weight, putting on muscle is not going to be as easy as continuously building strength, right? Because strength is multidimensional. It's not just about muscle. It could be neurological. It could be skill acquisition, adaptations, neurological adaptations. That's what I meant. But basically, a lot of things that are not directly related to the muscle size itself. For sure, the more muscle you are, the more capable you will be of being strong, because there's just more tissue to create force output. But you see a lot of people who are not the biggest, yet they're pulling like an extraordinary amount of weight, and that's a lot because they've just been practicing and they've been training for that specific task, and their nervous system and other factors can assist in achieving this. So basically, caloric deficit will impact hypertrophy more than it will impact strength. That was one of the main findings, or at least the finding that was the most interesting to me in this research. Another good point was that 500 calories deficit, so a 500 calorie deficit from your maintenance, seemed to be the cutoff point where that would almost fully blunt hypertrophy. Okay, so if your maintenance is at 2000 and you're eating 1500 calories or less, chances are that you will be putting on next to no muscle during that period, even if you're training hard. But that's okay, right? Because it's not a bad thing to not be putting on muscle if you can still be holding on to your muscle while you're dropping weight, right? Because if you're losing weight, you're dropping weight, and you're holding on to most of your muscle mass, what are you losing? Body fat. That's the whole point of a competition prep, or even a mini cut or a cut, is to be dropping significant amount of weight but as little muscle as possible. Therefore you're losing fat, and that's what we want. So I usually break it down like this when I talk with clients. When you're in a caloric deficit, your goal is to hold on to muscle and lose fat, and when you're in a surplus, the goal is to put on as much muscle with as little fat as possible. And maintenance is kind of this gray area where a bit of both happens, but there's a lot of factors that will implicate that, and I will tackle this more in the second research. But for this point, I will make it simple, right? Like, one of the takeovers of this research is that if your goal is to get jacked and build muscle, then being in deficit might not be the best idea. Okay, so you gotta be goal specific, and then if you want to be putting on muscle more than you want to be losing fat, then just don't be in a caloric deficit. Be at least at maintenance or more, and get this goal out of the way, and then move forward with the next one, because you will notice a significant impact on hypertrophy even if you're getting strong. The second thing is, if a caloric deficit is non-negotiable, whatever the reason is for you personally, you cannot not be in a deficit at that specific moment, then you want to try to at least keep your caloric deficit sub 500, right? So if we come back to that person that's 2000 calorie maintenance, then you want to be eating more than 1500 calories but less than 2000, so somewhere like 1750. That's a 250 calorie deficit, and you will probably still be losing weight slower, granted, but at the expense of perhaps be putting on a little bit of muscle during that period. Okay, so something to consider. Another very important point, this is some nuances and caveats regarding this. Your initial body composition as well as your training experience is going to impact the outcome greatly. Okay, that means that if you're overweight, or you're a novice, or even both, which is not unlikely, right? Overweight people, sometimes they start from scratch when they start training. Well, your chances are much greater of be putting on muscle despite being in a 500 calorie deficit. Okay, if you have a lot of body fat tissue on your body, and then as you're dropping weight, chances are that you're going to be building muscle, at least in the first half or third of your journey, are very possible. Okay, so something to consider if you find yourself being more overweight or you're just starting training. Don't necessarily limit the caloric deficit, because just by picking up weights, just by dropping weight but getting a bit stronger in the gym, maintaining that consistency in your training and increasing volume over time and performance, that alone might have tremendous impact, and you might not even need to worry about this. On the other hand, if you're someone who's more advanced or already lean, then you want to be perhaps more conservative in your caloric deficit. Another great point, which was maybe where I took this research and started thinking a lot more outside of the box with this, is how can these findings be used in practical application for me as a coach with the demographic that I work with and with the type of clients that I have. And it's that basically, it's unusual. Honestly, it happens more often than you would think that I work with people, young women, who love training, they want to train, but building muscle is not really something that they want to chase, right? They want to be lifting weight, they want to see performance increase, but they don't necessarily want to be putting on a lot of muscle. And they always come with those kind of preconceived thoughts that they will be becoming bulky and things like that. And it's okay. Like, I see a lot of coaches out there like, "Oh, lifting weight doesn't make you bulky," and you can say that, but again, these conclusions are based on observation and some research. But it's true that if you're eating in a surplus and you are training hard, like, I mean, you are putting on muscle, and if you're not losing fat and you're putting on muscle, you are going to look a bit more bulky. So what I really liked about this research is that I can basically really encourage my clients who are resisting building muscle that if they remain in a caloric deficit, 500 calories or more, then they will be able to still maintain strength and become stronger in the gym despite not be putting on a lot of muscle. And that, at least at the beginning, where they see a significant change in their body, they see the scale weight going down, they see the fat loss happening on their body, then they might feel more comfortable with like building muscle moving forward. So that's a super cool point. If you're a young woman who's lifting weight and you don't want to be bulky, but you want to train hard, just train hard. You will see your strength increase over time. Just be careful what you eat. I always say that if you're the training doesn't change much between someone who's on a weight loss or someone who's on a weight gain. It's really the caloric intake that's going to have a dramatic impact on the outcome of your body composition, right? So you want to be considering that a lot if you're part of those population or you're working with people who have this kind of narrative. You want to tell them like, that's fine, we're still going to train hard, that's not going to change, you're just going to have to be careful with how many calories you consume, remain in a deficit, and then you're almost certain that the chances of them putting on muscle is going to be a lot slower, except if they are overweight or novice, like I mentioned. But then again, if they're overweight, chances of them losing weight significantly in the beginning is also great. So it's pretty much bulletproof, and I really like this approach. I really like the fact that you can still get stronger despite not be putting on a lot of muscle. That can be a super useful tool in our toolkit at Team Solomon. So once again, to wrap up this first point, if you're in a deficit but you find yourself not getting smaller over time, you're probably just not in a deficit, okay? Because again, this research demonstrates that you can be eating in a 500 calorie deficit and putting on 10 pounds of muscle. It's very unlikely, and if that happens, then you're probably not just putting on muscle, you're putting on fat, and you're not actually in a deficit. You might be in a surplus, okay? Or you're so sedentary that your maintenance is shifting into a surplus. That's something to consider, but that's a talk of for another day. Number 2. Another study review. This one, the research paper was called Reduced Adaptive Thermogenesis During Acute Protein-Imbalanced Overfeeding is a Metabolic Hallmark of the Human Thrifty Phenotype. Hollstein and al. 2021. Whoa, what did that mean, right? Honestly, it's a very dense paper, and they were trying to, again, demonstrate if there's different phenotypes. So phenotype is the manifestation of your genome, okay? So you have genes, you have certain characteristic that your DNA has, and how it manifests itself is called a phenotype. So, you know, when people say, oh, that's genetics, well, what they're saying is that the phenotype of that people's genetic is this or something else or whatever. So basically, in this paper, they were trying to distinguish between two different phenotypes in different population, which is what they called spendthrift and thrifty. So spendthrift people are those who tend to seem to have an easier time losing weight, but they struggle to put on weight. Okay, some of you might associate to that, others don't, but they might know people who are more of that type. And thrifty people are those who tend to resist weight loss and have more of an ease to put on weight. Okay, so again, this paper seemed to demonstrate once again, and there's a lot of paper that have been demonstrating that there are in fact different types of people, different types of genetics, and these people will respond very differently depending on, it's a spectrum, right? So if you're in the middle, you might not see a big difference, but if you're more on the left or the right side, closer to a thrifty or a spendthrift, you might see those typical characters you encounter in your life, like they eat a lot of food, don't gain that much weight, or that person who just looks at a cake and gains 2 pounds, right? Well, a lot of time people will assume, oh, this is just because they're miscalculating their calories or they're not being honest with themselves. And that might be one of the reasons too. Most of the time it is, right? But other times it's actually their metabolism that is working against them if it's not going in the direction that they want, or with them if it's helping them accelerate their results in a specific direction. So thrifty individuals, they have, okay, so let me break that down, make it simple again. So spendthrift, people who will burn more calories when they're in a surplus, so they can eat a lot of food, not gain a lot of weight, but they have a hard time. They will eat a lot of food, not gain a lot of weight, and that might be a problem for them if they're trying to gain weight, but they will have an ease dropping weight if they're in a caloric deficit. And thrifty people are people who gain weight easily if they're in a surplus and have a hard time losing weight. You have to be aggressive deficit, high amount of cardio, manipulate these variables more frequently in order to achieve your weight goal. In both cases, you can achieve. It's just that it's less intuitive. It demands more work, demands more sacrifices to achieve that. Okay, but here's an interesting thing. So the thrifty people have a greater increase in metabolism when they go from a deficit to a maintenance. Okay? And then when you go from maintenance to surplus, it doesn't really increase much. And spendthrift people tend to have a small increase in metabolism when they go from maintenance to a surplus, but they have a great increase when they go from maintenance to a surplus, but a small increase when they go from deficit to maintenance. Okay, you still with me? It gets confusing, I know, because the person who has a slow metabolism in a surplus, thrifty, they put on weight, they will have a higher metabolism when they go from deficit to maintenance. That's when it's tricky, but that's a key point. That's a super interesting point, okay? Because that means that your thrifty individual will probably be a greater candidate to be in a recomposition type of approach with dieting, right? It's the kind of person that doesn't really benefit much from being in a surplus, because right away their metabolism is not going to change much from maintenance to surplus. Every calories that you add is mostly going to be stored as fat, because there's not a great metabolic compensation for that. But that person who's spendthrift, if you keep them at maintenance, chances are as soon as there's a little bit of increase in activity, they'll start losing weight again, or you don't really see much of an increase in their body composition because they're holding on. They tend to always drop in weight, so you have to keep increasing calories in order to make sure that you're driving hypertrophy, or that you're actually putting on tissue. So that's become super interesting as a coach. You actually have to monitor a lot closer your client's response to metabolism. That might take a few rounds of cycles of dieting and maintenance, and so it's okay to not get it from the get-go. Nobody has that identity written on their forehead, but with experience, I tend to really see rapidly which type of clients I'm dealing with, and I will try to adapt right away my coaching approach. And I used to do that already, but now having a research that breaks it down, it's not just bodybuilding lore or mythology. It's actually in fact happening in different individuals, and understanding that can help you make your decision. But I digress. I will try to stick to my bullet points before I dive a little deeper in the practical application of that. So what is actually being impacted metabolically, right? What is it that some people will burn more and people less? What can you name that changes, right? So the main thing I think is NEAT, okay? Non-exercise activity thermogenesis. It's becoming a very common buzzword online. A lot of people who are into training understand that word, but if you've never heard about it, it's basically all the calories that you burn in a day that are not part of your training, that they're not voluntarily, right? So fidgeting, walking around and using your hands a lot when you move, just spending a lot of energy throughout a day without realizing. Like, I always like this analogy: when your NEAT is low because your calorie intake is so low that you're like on survival mode, it's a kind of situation where like you catch yourself sitting down a lot more for simple tasks that you would usually be standing. Your body just resorts to sitting down more. Or you get out of the house and you forgot your earphones and you're like, oh fuck, my earphone. And in a normal situation you wouldn't even think about it, you'd be already running inside to get them, and now you're just like, oh fuck it, I just won't have them today. Like, that's how you start like limiting the amount of energy you burn in a day without realizing. And that's your NEAT. So NEAT in certain individual can really increase. You increase a bit of calories, NEAT increases a lot, And for other individual, you increase calories and NEAT doesn't even catch up. So right away it turns into a surplus, okay? There's also something that's called TEF, so thermic effect of feeding. Well, thermic effect of feeding is basically the calories that you spend for the food that you consume. But this might not be super relevant for this scenario because, well, the more food you eat, the more you're going to burn. So obviously, if spendthrift people eat more food because their NEAT is higher, then their thermic effect of feeding will be higher as well, and then that will cause even more calories burned. So it's kind of obvious that in specific scenario, spendthrift people will have a greater TEF than thrifty. So it's almost like inevitable that people who eat more food are going to be burning more calories, but it does play a role. It does accentuate that characteristic of these people. And then there's hormones, right? There's leptin. Leptin is an energy expenditure hormone. Thyroid hormones, also great energy expenditure hormones. So I don't know exactly, I haven't dived deep enough to understand why certain people have greater energy expenditure, but these hormones are a key player in energy expenditure. So I'm sure they're involved in the reason why certain people are going to be more thrifty or spendthrift. Okay, so I mentioned about recomposition, better for thrifty. Surplus, better for spendthrift. And one more occasion that this becomes a key point is circumstances like reverse dieting. Okay, so reverse dieting versus recovery diet. If you've never heard about these concepts, reverse dieting is basically when you finish a cut and then you will start bringing calories back slowly, like 50, 100 calories every week, slowly bringing your calories back to maintenance while trying to hold on to as much of the leanness that you've acquired and recovering your metabolism slowly. So you're basically staying in a deficit longer. You're just pulling out of that deficit. Personally, not a huge fan of it because that's like you stepping in the fire, and then when it's time to come out, you're like walking slowly out of the fire rather than just jumping into an ice bath to try to like reduce that heat, although that might give you a heart attack, but that's just an analogy. So basically, if I was in a fire, I would jump out of the fire right away, right? Rather than just slowly stepping out. I don't want to stay in the heat much longer than I need to. That would be reverse dieting. Yes, you hold on to your leanness, but at what cost? That's debatable. Another option would be a recovery diet, where when you finish the diet, you right away bounce back to maintenance. So that might be a couple 100, 500, whatever amount of calories that your measured predicted maintenance is, and then you just bounce back overnight. That will cause some weight gain rapid at the beginning, but that's usually the weight gain that you need to be gaining anyways in order to have all your hormones functioning normally. So being at 4% body fat year long is not realistic. So why try to stretch it longer than need to? Because you're going to end up recovering that fat anyways for you to be functioning properly. But here's the key. Here's a good point. Somebody who's thrifty and doesn't really burn more calories as soon as you get into a surplus, but burns a lot of calories as you get closer to maintenance, okay? That's a thrifty individual. Can be a great candidate for a reverse diet because you're bringing calories slowly. One, because you're scared to bust the maintenance and fall into surplus right away. If you add 300, 400, 500 calories and you go over your predicted maintenance by mistake, then you end up putting on too much fat and it sucks, right? So what you do is you walk your way up slowly. That will cause a great increase in calorie because in energy expenditure, I mean, because you're getting closer to maintenance, which is where thrifty people seems to have the higher energy expenditure level increase. So reverse diet could be good for candidates that tend to have a hard time losing weight. But a recovery diet would be awesome for someone that has a spendthrift metabolism, because, and this I've experienced it with certain clients. My clients who are usually those who have the easiest time losing weight and a hard time gaining weight. Like I have girls who are 120 pounds consuming over 3,000 calories because they just have crazy metabolism. Well, guess what? When they're dieting, yeah, they still have to bring their calories fairly low, but 1,700, 1,400 is plenty for them to get super lean. But what do you think I do when the diet's over? I don't walk my way up slowly. I know that they have a crazy metabolism even when they're in a surplus, so I will jack up their calories. I've sometimes jacked up calories by almost 1,000 calories overnight. I tend to be a bit more conservative because throwing 1,000 calories more overnight might have zero implication on your metabolism, but it will have other implication on your digestion and on your relationship with food and a lot of things, okay? So, but I will jack up calories pretty significantly, like easily 500 overnight. And guess what happens? They end up losing weight. There's like this super compensation from their metabolism that happens that makes them end up losing weight. Like granted, there's more water being flushed out than fat, but it's still kind of wicked to witness. And then they right away end up needing more calories like a couple of days later, and we start ramping them up fairly aggressively until we reach like a cruising speed. And that would be doing a slow reverse diet with these candidate would be such a waste of time, waste of precious time, where you could be bringing so much more nutrients and factors to cause more hypertrophy. If you're not dieting anymore, then you're obviously in a situation when you want to be building muscle. Oh, I'm rambling here. But for those who are still with me, after 25 minutes of rambling, I'm going to dive into the last point, which was a presentations by James Krieger. So it wasn't a research paper, but it was a really cool presentation by James Krieger that it was a video, but as well there was a PowerPoint, and there was a lot of things he discussed, but there's a few key points that I thought personally in my own practice can be super useful. And the topic of this presentation was, can you really optimize your hormones to better fat loss? And it was kind of a bit of how they call this, I forgot what's it called. Oh, that's killing me. But you know, these titles were like, they kind of trap you into wanting to read more, but it turns out that it's not really, there's no secret, right? So the reality is that, quite frankly, you can't really optimize your metabolism. And the main reason for that is because it's too complex to manipulate with a few dietary manipulation or throwing a supplement. Like there's nothing you can do to really change a complete outcome of your metabolism, because there's a ton of variables and they all interact with each other. And so it's virtually impossible to like manipulate one specific thing. Like I want to burn more calories, because you're going to manipulate that hormone, but that also going to inhibit other hormones, and then that's going to result into a completely different outcome than what you wanted. And that's usually how your body works. Like it works very well on its own. You can assist, you can do things to improve, but there's nothing that you can do to like fully optimize specific hormones. But there's other ways to do it. Before I dive into it, here's just a breakdown of all the things that are a few of all the things that are involved in your metabolism. Leptin, energy expenditure, appetite. Insulin, appetite and recomposition. Thyroid, energy expenditure. Ghrelin, appetite. Cortisol, appetite, recomp. Growth hormone, recomp. Testosterone, recomp. Estrogen, recomp. Glucagon, recomp. Cholecystokinin, appetite. Adiponectin, energy expenditure. Glucagon-like peptide 1, appetite, and peptide YY, PYY, appetite. That's just a few of all the things that are involved in metabolism. So can you really do one thing to affect one without affecting any of the others? Not really. What you can play on, though, is appetite. So you can suppress appetite. One way I like to do is coffee. So caffeine, I unfortunately haven't found any research that confirms that caffeine is an appetite suppressor. But I mean, I don't know if it's indirectly the stims, or if it's because usually coffee has a lot of water in it, so it fills you up for a short period of time. But to me, it has really helped me with appetite suppression. That could be anecdotal, but I hear a lot of people mentioning it too, so can't kill to try. But another thing that you can do to manipulate your appetite in order to influence your caloric intake, right? You're less hungry, you'll eat more less food, you eat less food, less calories. A method that they demonstrated in this paper, in this presentation, there was a lot of research that he presented that all have kind of the same outcome, was that whey protein gives a spike in insulin. A spike in insulin can act as an appetite suppressor. Okay, that's why carbs fill you up. One of the reasons why carbs might also help inhibit hunger. When you eat carbs, you're more satiated. I always assume it's because most whole food carb-based have like a more fiber. If you think about the grains, the wheat, the potatoes, the starch. That's what I was looking for. Starch. All these things are like good source of carbs that also have fair amount of fibers. Fruit as well, that fills you up. But I think there might be also insulin playing a key role into inhibiting hunger post meal. But one thing that some people might not be aware of is that whey protein actually gives as high of a spike in insulin as carbs. And that might be like, what the fuck? But it's also a really good thing, because you're getting two of both worlds. You're consuming whey protein, which is super high in leptin, and high leptin is going to cause greater chances of putting on lean body mass, but you also get an appetite suppressor effect. So me personally, it's purely anecdotal. In this current deficit phase that I'm in, because work is so crazy, I had to resort to more protein shakes, and I was extremely uneasy about that, because to me, liquid food is not food, and there's no way that liquid food is going to fill me up. But I was surprisingly happy to find out that recently I'm having 2 shakes a day between my meals, and just because I have them on the go right away before going to my next client, and I catch myself not thinking about food for an extended period of time. Like, I feel actually filled up. As soon as I drink my shake, my appetite, my hands are shaking, or anything that I could be experiencing that's telling me like I need food right now, as soon as I drink a shake, it vanishes like in the minute that followed. And reading this presentation made me realize that, this is not a coincidence. It's actually the whey causing my insulin to spike and my appetite to drop. So that can be a super cool hack. In this paper, what I really liked is that they used that with participant and had them eat an ad libitum meal. Okay, so it's like an all-you-can-eat meal. They could eat as much as they wanted, and group of people who were consuming a whey protein shake compared to other sorts of shake or control group ended up consuming significantly less calories, even though they can eat as much as they want. So that has become one of my secret weapon with clients, right? Like, when clients ask, what can I do before a night out if I don't want to be busting my cows or cheating too much? I always say, have a lean protein if you're eating out, with like veggies or carbs, low carbs, or whatever, dressing on the side. All these things you can do to kind of limit the amount of calories you're going to consume. But another way, if there's a lot of temptation in front of you, is having a shake on your way to that dinner, and then potentially you'll be less tempted to eat all the nice food that's in front of you. So that can be a super easy trick. And guess what? You're consuming a bit more protein. You're spiking your leucine for that moment. Like, it's never a bad thing. There's no downfall to this approach. One mention was that there was a group consuming a whey protein shake 4 hours before a meal, and a group doing 90 minutes before a meal in 2 different research. The 90 minutes seemed to have a greater impact than the 4 hours. So if you're going to actually use this technique to limit appetite before going to a social event, you want to have that shake ready, but like in the car on your way there 30 minutes before that event. Don't have it too early. Another thing to consider is that if you tend to have craving at nights, sometimes having a shake can just cut those craving enough for you to make it to bedtime without falling into a box of cracker or things like that. So these was my 3 bullet point this week. I used a lot of this time to do some good reading and diving deeper into different concepts. So I hope this can be useful for some of you guys. Cheers.